So it's my great pleasure to have Bob Dennis here. Bob is the chairman and CEO of Genesco. It's a publicly traded company headquartered here in Nashville, but with operations both domestic and abroad. Bob joined Genesco in Nashville about 6 years ago and has done an outstanding job as a shareholder. I certainly have, with great appreciation, watched the appreciation of the stock and what he's done for the company and how he's led it. He's a very interesting strategist, interesting background, and I'll ask Bob to introduce himself a little bit, but grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and pretty famous family, and we might get into some of that background a little bit, as well as his education, starting Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at age 16, and later Harvard Business School, and then on in life from thereafter. So we'll be talking about some of that. So Bob, you want to give us a little color to that background, if you would?
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of a roadmap, since part of what we're going to talk about today is just career. So as Jim noted, I grew up in New York. I went off to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is primarily an engineering school, and it has the distinction probably of having a name that most of the freshmen cannot correctly spell. I stayed there for a bachelor's and a master's in biochemistry, organic chemistry, and then left there and got a job as an engineer down in Charlotte, North Carolina, making polyester fibers in the heyday of the leisure suit, which most of you are too young to remember, which is good. And did a little something entrepreneurial in the same space as that. Took that business Chapter 11, an experience I don't recommend, but you learn a lot from it. And from there, I went off to business school. I came out of business school broke, and so I needed to make some money, so I went to McKinsey. And I thought I was going to go there for about 2 or 3 years as essentially a postdoc in business, and I ended up staying there for a little over 12 years. And I finished up there as a partner leading the North American retailing practice. When I left there, I decided that I wanted to get a little more adventurous, and I got involved while at McKinsey. One of my clients had been in the automotive space, so I knew a lot about retail in automotive, and went off and started a company called Asbury Automotive Group, which is now a publicly traded New York Stock Exchange company. And it was a simple thesis of being able to roll up dealerships and get some economies of scale out of operating a large dealership group. And you're probably aware of the fact there's 5 of them now, AutoNation being the biggest. I left there, and I was looking for another adventure, and I had someone bring me a business that was considering some consolidation. There was a business in Indianapolis called Hat World at the time, and they had about 150 stores in the Midwest selling hats. And they were doing reasonably well in terms of growth, and they were running it around break even. And their bigger competitor that had been based in Boston, called Lids, had gone Chapter 11. And the investment thesis was that Hat World ought to buy the assets of Lids and get a national footprint and get the scale. And the board, it was a privately held company, the board of Hat World wanted someone to come in and say, does this business plan make sense? So I flew out to Indianapolis, met with the founders and the senior team, and went through the business plan and said, absolutely, you need to do this. It's a lot of risk in it because of the execution of taking in bankrupt assets, but it is the way you make this thing sing. And so they had said to me, I had said to them, you know, you're going to need a little more leadership. The young guys that have created Hat World isn't going to be enough horsepower in terms of getting this done. And I gave them a couple of names because I'm from New York, and this was in Indianapolis. And so they said, well, we want you. And then it's quick background. My wife is from New York, and she's lived in New York, London, Tokyo, and LA. When we got married in 1995, sorry, is this tape running?
We can edit.
1996. she had said to me, you know, somewhere in our life we ought to go live in a foreign country. So I came home and I said, you're going to get your wish. We're going to Indiana. And so we moved to Indiana in 2001. In 3 years, the way I just sequenced it is we bought it, we fixed it, and we sold it. And in the sale process, we hired a banker and toured the country with both private equity and with strategics, and we ended up selling it to Genesco. And so about a year into that adventure, the CEO of Genesco, Hal Pennington, who was approaching his 70th birthday, said, I need a successor, and I'd like you to be the guy. And so here we are in Nashville, and I've been here now for 6 or 7 years with Genesco and having an absolutely terrific time. So that's the 30-second, probably more than 30-second summary of how I ended up here in Nashville, Tennessee.
So it's always interesting to kind of hear where somebody came from a little bit. If you would, talk about your family a little bit, your mom and dad in Brooklyn.
Well, I grew up, we said in Brooklyn. All of my grandparents were immigrants. My father's parents came from Hungary. And my father's father was a machinist in Hungary and then came here at a reasonably young age and started working at Rockefeller University of New York on York Avenue as a machinist for the scientists who were developing a lot of medical technology. And he knew that and this is a reasonably poor family living in the Flatbush area of Brooklyn, and he knew my father enjoyed photography. And so he machined up a camera for his graduation present. And so my father very much got into photography. And there's a lesson here about just sort of, if you figure out what you want to do, just start figuring out how to do it. My father, in those days, nowadays if you have messengers in New York, they ride bicycles. Believe it or not, back in the early 1940s, the messengers roller skated around New York City. So my father got his roller skates out, got a job at a photographic lab, which would deliver the prints to the studios and pick up the film from the studios to get developed, because most of it, that's how photography was done back then. And then he'd hang out at the studios to try and figure out if he can get a job. And sure enough, he was not only hanging out in a studio and got a job, but was very fortunate to have hooked up with a guy who turned out to be a rock star. So he hooked up with a photographer named Francois Scavullo, who became a very famous photographer and did all the covers for Cosmo magazine, which is probably what he's most famous for. Scavullo brought my father to Vogue. So my father, next thing you know, is working at Vogue, came out from under Scavullo, so he was a photographer at Vogue, which is that's pretty good on your resume if you're a photographer. And then had just a wonderful career, shifted out of doing magazine work to doing catalog work. Now it would be probably web work, but back in the day, he photographed most of the women's section of the Sears catalog and the JCPenney catalog. And so, it's a little bit of a lesson learned just growing up of saying, well, if you want to do something, figure out a way to do it. It's not necessarily going to happen in the recruiting office where the interviewers show up. Now, he came from a different circumstance. And the other thing that I got exposed to, obviously, is retail. And one of the family sports was whenever the Sears catalog or the JCPenney catalog would come out, or the New York Times Magazine, where he did a lot of work, we would go through it, flip through it. He would critique it. We'd pay attention. We'd make jokes about the models. And so I just got a taste of retail at a very early stage in a sort of weird way.
And your mom, what was her background?
Well, and this is where the story's great, because my father, this is one of the benefits, I guess, of being a male fashion photographer, is you get to meet female models. So my father went on a shoot to Arizona for 2 weeks, and there were 4 models on the shoot. He was single. And so one of those models turned out to be my mother. One of those models turned out to become my aunt, because she met my mother's brother. One of these, this will test how far back you can go. One of the models was named Jeannie Davis. She became Jeannie Martin, because she married a guy named Dean Martin. He was a very sort of Sinatra contemporary. And then the fourth model was a woman named Grace Kelly. My mother reminded us for our entire life that she won out over Grace Kelly.
I think that's a great story. So, chemical engineering, consulting, all these areas, where along the line did you decide what you were good at? How did you discern that and figure out where that would take you? You weren't going to roller skate, you weren't going to photograph models. Where did you go? Where did you learn you did well?
Well, I'm not sure it's as much figuring out what I was good at as figuring out what I wanted to do.
Okay.
And there's a connection between that. You know, you tend to like stuff that you're good at. But in my instance, I had to play around a little more with what I was going to choose to do because I got started at such a young age. So I was off to college at 16, majoring in the sciences because I was good at math. And so from that, started to sort of work my way through career choices with a father in photography who doesn't really relate to math. I don't know where the math came from. So I ended up just experimenting with things. And so I was going to be a professor when I was in graduate school getting my master's. I was getting a PhD, but I opted out with the master's. And then I was an engineer, and that seemed a little too granular, and I shifted within that. Before business school, I shifted over to the commercial side on really sales. And then I started to find my groove. And then after we took that business 11, I decided to go to business school. And that's where I really started to see the world from a wider perspective in terms of possibilities for me. And then that led to McKinsey and on from there. And it's just a continued experience of revisiting what you enjoy doing and keeping your eyes open for other opportunities.
You've had some serendipity events or moments in life. What have those centered around?
Well, I've always been open to the idea that, you know, again, like my father, the next opportunity may not just come from the recruiting office per se. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I was fairly conventional going to McKinsey because I think they probably hired more than anybody else in the class. But, you know, as an example, I was at McKinsey and I'd been there about 18 months. And the firm was smaller in those days, so and I was in New York where the managing director was. So the managing director at the time was a guy named Ron Daniel. I had just finished a project, and Ron on every Friday would take 3 associates to lunch, which would be hard to do now, but in those days that's the way he helped figure out what was going on at the firm. And so he took the 3 of us to lunch, and he was waxing on about how necessary it is to get associates to move around the world, because that's the way we kept the culture consistent. Also a great learning experience for associates. And he whipped up such a fervor, but at the end of the lunch, I raised my hand and said, "Ron, I'm ready to go." And he said, "Great." And he said, "What languages do you speak?" And I said, "Well, English, and even that not so good." And he said, "Not so well." And so he decided that I should probably go to an English-speaking part of the world for us, which was obviously the UK and Australia, but also Scandinavia, where we were operating in English more for practical purposes because it was so small. And I had a good friend I'd gone to business school with, and he was Danish and living in Copenhagen, and I said, "That sounds more interesting and more different." I went for interesting and different, and I ended up spending about 2.5 years living in Copenhagen, but moving around all through Scandinavia and a little bit of Europe. And I sort of just made that decision over dessert.
What was the influence of that experience on the rest of your career, or what you took away from that is where it led you to?
Well, the first thing, I'd encourage anybody, and especially the Americans, if you haven't gone and lived overseas, figure out a way to do it, because I think Americans in particular are so US-centric that you have a hard time figuring out how the rest of the world does things differently until you have context. And some of you may know we just made an acquisition last summer in the UK of our closest competitor, or the mirror image of our Journeys business here in the US. And I'm absolutely convinced that having lived in another country for a sustained period, so really living as a consumer, that I understood that there were differences, and it's not even cultural, it's almost habitual, that countries evolve in different ways, and that doesn't mean that it's wrong. And so I've had to coach my US team on the fact that some of the business practices in the UK are what they are, and because the whole competitive environment has defined itself around that, it's hard to leave that box. So, you know, simple stuff like they get very promotional on the 15th of December, which for us is nuts because we do it right after New Year's. But since everybody else gets promotional, you're never going to be able to leave that. And then there are more subtle differences about the way the consumers want you to serve them. And so you learn by living elsewhere that cultures develop habits, and habits matter, particularly when you're in the consumer side of the business world. So I'd encourage everyone to go do that.
So you talked a little bit about kind of what you learned about yourself and what you were perhaps good at or needed to be good at. How has that evolved or changed? Have there been any learning experiences or aha moments that you came across and said, okay, this is a learning experience for me?
Well, and there's two parts of development that I think about along those lines. One is, what do you need to be good at as your career moves along? And in my view, that changes a lot. It changed a lot for me. From being an associate at McKinsey to being a manager at McKinsey to being a CEO requires almost a different mindset about how you get things done. And if you're going to change how you get things done, then the way you lead has to be different. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The other half of it is just personal intrinsics and how you do that. So I'll start there instead.
Okay.
And you know, there was an article in the New York Times on Sunday about Charlotte Beers, written by her, I think, that spoke about her aha moment. And it's not always going to be an aha moment, but you've got to have a certain level of self-reflection in order to develop. And so she went through life thinking that everyone kind of got what she was all about, which was being inclusive and being encouraging, when in fact, through a feedback mechanism, she learned that she was extremely intimidating to people. And so the dynamics in the room when she was there is intimidating. And when I come back to what I believe is great leadership, that's a huge flaw. And so then being aware of it, she fixed it. But the hardest step is probably the awareness. So I had my aha moment, and it actually happened in Denmark. And bear with me because it's a bit of a longer story, but there's just so many good lessons, I think, in the story. I had been there for only a couple of months, and I was working in Sweden at the time with the most senior partner out of Sweden, a guy named Christian Kaspar, who is Swedish. And we were serving Volvo. Volvo had discovered that, and this was, I guess we're always wrestling with Iran. In this loop on Iran, this is sort of after the hostages, so there's still the post-mortem of the hostage crisis. A lot of people had embargoed Iran, so they were trading cars for oil because there was no hard currency in Iran. And they had discovered that that worked pretty well, that they could trade the cars for the oil, and that worked out pretty well. But then they were losing, I don't know, probably 20 basis points in the trade of the oil to cash. And they said, well, that recommends that we should be in the oil trading business. It's not obvious to everyone, maybe. And it wasn't obvious to me. And we were hired to go in and try to help them develop this idea of being in the oil trading business. Well, we got into the first meeting with this head of strategy at Volvo, and he started articulating why they wanted to be in the oil trading business. And I thought I was extremely adept at interrupting him on every key point that I perceived to be wrong and correcting him on his logic. And that's a kind way, I think, of describing what I did. So the meeting went on for our prescribed hour, and then we were due to go visit the next day and pick up. And we got out to the sidewalk, and Christian looked at me, and there's just so much embedded in this first thing he said to me. He said, "Bob, do I understand correctly you're from New York?" Now think about that. How much he put into that. Of course, I'm clueless because I think he's actually interested in my geography. And I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. And he said, you know, I lived in New York for a while. And one of the things that I discovered while I was in New York was you guys are all just so quick. You're so smart and right on the ball. And you know, you guys are very, and I started acting like that. And when I got back to Sweden, I realized that the Swedes are very pensive, you know, and they like to think about things. This is all nonsense, but this is his method of delivering a message that lets me off the hook. He said, you know, the Swedes are more pensive, and we'll probably will be able to work with this guy if we give him a little space just to kind of lay out his thoughts. I said, I can do that. He goes, you know, when I came back here, I think he made this up too. He said, when I came back here, I had a little bit of a little method, a little secret sauce on how to sort of recheck my behavior to be more Swedish. And I said, well, what was that? He said, well, I would have a pen, and I'd put it on the table when the client is speaking. And then when the client would finish speaking, I would silently count to 3, slowly. And at 3, I'd lift the pen. The client hadn't started speaking again, it would be okay to jump in because that would be the natural point to carry on the conversation. So he said, Bob, tomorrow we're going to go back and see this guy, and what do you say we try and use the pen thing as just experiment with it? And I said, that's good. And he said, and then just for this meeting, why don't I hold the pen? So we went to the next meeting, and I was like a dog salivating on a bone. I couldn't take my eye off of the pen. Not sure I heard a word he said, and it took probably another couple of days for it to dawn on me what lesson I was learning. And I learned not too far after that that was a pattern I had that was my Charlotte Beers thing, that I felt like I had answers and I had to get them out there. And the further I go in my career, the more important it is that I listen. What I did with my team at Genesco, just to close off this story, is I deliberately tell everybody the story. And I say, if I need a pen, hand me one. And it's funny, because then with a funny story, I've given everyone who works with me the license to tell me, you know, I'm sort of in AA, and so I have to get constant reminders to check my behavior. So, long story, fun story, but also one that says, first, you know, become very self-aware all along the way. And as Charlotte Beers noted, and as I noted, you may not know what it is that you need to work on. And then the flip side of that is if you can find clever ways to give feedback that let people off the hook the way Christian did, that's a true art form.
I want to open this up to some questions for a little bit. I have some more that we want to talk about, including a personal story or two. But I wondered if this triggered any thing you wanted to talk about or ask about. So could I open it up for questions, please?
Did you always, or once you hit Harvard Business School, did you aspire to be a CEO, or do you feel like it was just something you fell into, or at what point did you realize that was going to be your path?
I've been living the world, I've been living the dream all along, and always thinking that I've gotten further than I almost deserved to get. So, no, I had never imagined that I would do this. Now, it's interesting that when I contemplated leaving McKinsey, and we had sort of a cabal of people where we went out for beers and everybody gave, you know, the toasts and everything, that one of my good friends said, and I argued with him, he said, you know, you'll be the CEO of Fortune 1000. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he said what he said, and I wasn't honestly was not a believer of that. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I never operated with that expectation. And it's probably just me, and maybe a little bit of sort of coming from Brooklyn as being part of that.
Other questions? Yeah.
When you joined Genesco, or maybe even kind of under a startup, what were the steps to getting in there and really be clicking as far as a part of the culture and that you understood players, where to go from there?
Yep, it's a good question. And it's a really good question because Genesco had a shaky history of bringing CEOs from the outside. The most successful CEOs had come from the inside, including my predecessor. So I was a little in between. What was really beneficial to everyone involved, including me, is that Genesco acquired Hat World, now renamed Lid Sports. I stayed in Indianapolis for the first year. I came down here probably 6 times a year for 3 or 4 day stretches, and I started to get immersed in the culture. And it was an interesting time because at that point I didn't think I was going to stay at Genesco. I had not officially an earn-out, but I had a sort of a structure that said I ought to hang around for 1 more year. But after that, I felt like I was a bit of a free agent. And so that gave me the freedom to sit in executive management team meetings, and there were 8 of us in the room, and to really say what I thought. And I guess the lesson learned is that's probably a good thing, because what I got out of that, I've learned subsequently, is I earned a lot of respect from the rest of the team. And it helped to be an outsider, because I could say, well, why do you guys do that? And it was a question worth answering, and they were kind of stuck in some old habits. The second thing was, and this sort of goes to my CEO management philosophy, I went around to each of the management team, and we're structured so that we're not quite a holding company, but we're directionally like that. So I have 4 operating heads who run businesses. And I listened a lot to what they thought their opportunities were, and also asked them specifically about how they thought they could be most successful operating. And what I heard from most of them was a certain degree of independence. And if you think about that in the environment we're in, that's almost necessary, because if I start intruding on too much decision making that they make, then when you get to the end of the year and they look at results, you've handed everybody excuses. Well, that was your call, you know. And so we're structured very much by saying, the operating heads, you're in charge of your businesses. And I started writing every email with a final line that said, but it's your call. And at the beginning, you know, CEOs, when you say it's your call, they don't really mean that. But I would actually go down and visit with people and say, look, I've given you my view of this issue as it's come up, but I really think it's your call. And you know, tell me what you're thinking, and let's have the argument one more time. And in some cases, I'd even steer them in their direction. I'd say, look, I have my view, you have your view, let's go your way. And I developed a level of collaboration with my team so that they now feel they can take advantage of what I can do best for them, which is think strategically about some big issues. And then I get involved in pretty much 0 operating decisions. And so it took about 6 months to probably develop that groove, which is pretty fast and a measure of the fact that we're not that big a company right now. But it was very important to find that working relationship with the operators in particular and make it work.
Other questions? Donnie?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So we are MBA students and few executive MBA students in the world, and we think we're very busy because of our calendars.
Very busy.
Yeah. So you're chairman and you're CEO of a very large company. How do you maintain balance? I mean, because I'm looking at my Outlook and I'm thinking, oh my God, I have all this stuff to do. How do you do it, and how do you possibly maintain balance in your life?
Well, one big piece goes back to what I just described, which is I do not try to make anywhere near the number of decisions that I probably have the license and the freedom to make should I choose. So, our operating philosophy, our operating design is we get together as an executive team with the next layer of management as well in the room. So it's pretty big meeting once a month. And that is my primary window on what's going on in a 1 month, 3 month, 6 month horizon. And I have my input there, and then I zip it. I just don't. I'll send off the occasional email of observations I have if I visit a store, but I don't get that involved, and I really work hard to stay very strategic. The other thing that I learned, and I didn't do this for a long time, but and at McKinsey it was very different and difficult because you're client responsive. But I started to calendar my entire life, not just my business life. And so I have a calendar that has my children's events, my athletic events, sort of my workout time, and and I scan it to say, is this reasonable? And I'm usually booking my stuff ahead of the business. And every once in a while I got to do what I got to do, which is something comes up and I have to erase something off the calendar. But I work with a pretty strict rule of thumb. One of the reasons I left McKinsey is I saw that the lifestyle was going to eat me up. And it's very personal. Some people thrive on the 60, 70-hour week. It's what they live for. And I encourage you to really do a self-examination as to whether that's what you live for. And if it is, go for it. And if it isn't, then design a different life. I've been fortunate to be able to design a different life when I kind of recognized that that wasn't the direction that I wanted to be in. And staying with that theme, I'd particularly caution you to resist the peer pressure to go where people more generally go. And I went to McKinsey, so I went mainstream. But at this point, I'm in my late 50s, so I have a lot of business school colleagues who are in the 50s-ish range. And I will tell you, if you group them and you do the happiness index, it is lowest for the investment bankers. Because it doesn't stop. I mean, the life is very demanding. And with that said, there are a few that just thrive on it and love it. But it is a very challenging business. It wears you out. And your opportunities don't grow necessarily as you age, except unless you're one of those miraculous rainmakers, of which there's a couple, a handful. But beyond that, it's a very challenging life. And so I partly design my life by ending up more on the company side, and then within the company I design it further. I'll tell you one other story. I have one guy who works for me who didn't do that. And I saw his health suffer. And I collaborated with him and his wife, and I actually he gave me his yearly objectives, and I added his health as number one. And he told me he's in his 50s, 60s. It was very difficult for him to not be in the office at 6:30. That sounds pretty amazing to me, but he had to break a 40-year habit of always being now he comes in at 7:30 because he does a treadmill for an hour. And so you just need perspective, and always challenge yourself on whether you got that perspective. I think it matters a lot.
So this program that we run in leadership here spends a lot of time talking about leadership thoughts and objectives and styles and those kinds of things. You've been sharing, I think, a very important piece on leading your own life and how you balance that. Are there some other leadership things you've learned along the way that you'd want to share and say, this has worked for me?
Well, as I said, before, what you need to do as a leader changes a lot. So when I was an associate, it's more about being prepared. That's because you're leading. That's your role in the team. And it's not a habit to ever lose, but then you got to start layering things on. And when you're your mid-career, you have to learn how to get the best out of your people. And I actually had a partner who I was working a lot with come to me after I'd been at the firm about 4 or 5 years and said, you do a really terrific job of getting the most out of a mediocre team. Now, I ended up with mediocre teams because if you understand the dynamics at a place like McKinsey, retail is not the most appealing place to be. So some of the, the most ambitious stars go to financial services. You need Fortune 50. That's where the sweet spot is for McKinsey, and retail doesn't have a lot up there. So I used to get, and she said, and I hadn't thought of it that way, but what I did was invest a lot of time in individuals. And part of that means figure out what they're good at, figure out what they're not good at. Don't set them up to fail, set them up to be a part of the team in the way that they can be most able to do that. And unless you're at a couple of very, very distinctive places, you're going to have people who are flawed. So you have to figure out how to make that work. Then when you get to my level as CEO, now we have 20,000 employees, then the challenge is so different because I really don't touch that many people directly. It's just impractical. And so I am more about themes, and then therefore it's a lot about communicating. And communicating well to 20,000 people means you have to learn to really simplify. Because your messages that are too complicated, they get lost. You learn the art of repetition. So don't be afraid to say it over and over and over because it works its way. And then take every opportunity. So I had been CEO for about a year, and unconsciously I was doing something that then I realized we would do consciously. As you know, as a public company, we release our earnings and then we do a conference call with investors. Well, you'd think that the conference call is for the investors, and to some extent it is, but guess what? Hundreds of our employees are dialed in to the investor call, and I'd unconsciously been aware of that, but then I realized, you know what? I'm writing the script, and by the way, from the preparation standpoint, we script it. Actually write it out, be very thoughtful about what we want to say, and then I write it for the employees. And what's interesting is Jim Gulmy is our CFO, and we sit around and talk about how we get things done, and it's almost scary that I can say something on the earnings call, our town hall meetings, in summary memos to senior team, repeating the same theme, and next thing you know, the mantra gets picked up by everybody. And so you have to be very aware of what you're messaging, and you have to keep it very simple, and you have to do it over and over and over. And that's not something I was used to because I didn't, at McKinsey you don't do it that way. It's more complicated, and you've got an audience that's a different audience, so you spend a lot more time on other things.
I want you to tell a story in a second, but other questions?
You mentioned the importance of being self-aware, just wondering besides that, that person's telling you in sort of a quirky way, what are some of your methods of really just gaining some insight as to how people view you that you've used over the years?
Yeah. Great question. One thing I do is and this is fun, I came to Genesco and I did what I had done a long time ago, but I was a quasi-outsider, so it was different. I do, at my year-end sit down with each of my executive team, we talk about the future. I say, now I want you to talk about me. And I remember one guy in particular, and the guy who had the health issues, this was before we had become, at this point, I think, pretty good friends. He had said, you're doing great. And you have to work everyone, and again, repetition kicks in. Say, no, I really want to know it. And then actually, I go out and lead with some of my weaknesses and say, for me, it's always, am I listening to you guys? Because I tell the story and I say, I have a history of not listening all that well. And, then you get, well, you do that a little bit, and you crack at the door open a little bit, and next thing you know, you can have a conversation. The other thing that I do is I have very fortunate to have maintained a lot of friendships. And this is sort of a different twist on it, but so I have two very good friends who are in positions like mine, who are CEOs. And with one of them, we actually have a structured monthly call. And it's like having your psychiatrist, you know, because I know him so well, there's nothing at stake, confidentiality is off the charts. And we spend a lot of time just going back and forth. Some of it's about us, some of it's about the people that we work with. And because we do it so frequently, we get continuity, so we have context. So I can actually tell you a lot about this one company. And so you take advantage of people who can give you good feedback, with the caveat that the people who work for you it might be challenging to draw out from them. So then you try to rely on other sources to find out what you need to know. And then just keep reminding yourself that you are in learning mode.
So I want to do one self-awareness story that I just love this story. I was trying to figure out how to fit it in, and I think this is a great way. So Bob plays the piano. He's played the piano for quite a few years. Moves to Nashville, and it's Christmas time, and you go to a Christmas party.
Yes.
Can you pick it up from there for me?
Well, and I've been here only, more specifically, I've been here only 3 weeks. And again, I'm from Brooklyn, where country music is basically illegal. So I go to a friend's house, someone I knew from my New York days, and it's his birthday. And his wife says, it's a Friday night, it's casual, everybody's in jeans, it's a really nice setting, and could you go and play Happy Birthday for Carl? And I said, I'd be happy to do that. So I sit down and everybody sings. There were some good singers in the room. And then I keep playing a little bit of jazz, and the party's breaking up. So I get out of my chair, and this woman walks up to me, very Southern, and she says, that was mighty fine playing. And I said, well, thank you. She said, how long you been playing? I said, since I was 3. I said, do you play? She said, well, I can finger out a tune. I said, do you sing? She said, singing's kind of my thing. I said, come over to my house, I'll play, you sing, and we'll have great fun. And then I got to the front door, and the hostess and my wife were there laughing at me, so I asked them, I said, okay, who was that? And it was Faith Hill. So,
And so
I'm not sure where the self-awareness part comes in, but it is my arrival in Nashville story.
there's a piece of self-awareness there somewhere. Talk a little bit about, if you could, as you think back and look back and your own leadership efforts, what have you learned along the way from, and I won't say mistakes or mishaps, but how has, we don't all be successful at everything we try in life. Where has that been an example for you that has been helpful to learn something from seeing something else happen that wasn't quite right?
Yeah, I've had a few of those. You know, one is that I am a bit of a Boy Scout. So, you know, it's hard to say that the value of a company is not integrity, right? Is integrity, I mean, no company says, we're trying not to have a lot of integrity. So let's acknowledge that. But I kind of work on a scale, just as a personal thing, that's a little more off the charts. And as a result of that, and that's it's a level of self-awareness, and whether I'm right about drawing such a sharp line or not, it is who I am. So, you know, my departure from McKinsey was partly triggered by the fact that I thought the firm had lost its way, and not quite to the extreme that the Goldman Sachs letter and the Wall Street Journal was detailing, but directionally like that in the late 90s. And so, you know, I struggled a little bit with it, and it was hitting me personally, so they can make the same accusation of me as they made of him, that, oh, wait a minute, you had your personal agenda. But I walked away saying, you know what, it just has drifted a bit beyond where I'm comfortable. And in the case of McKinsey, it wasn't really integrity as it was, they had gotten very commercial, and if you're going to be client first, which by the way is in Goldman's mission, then be client first. But don't say it and don't do it. And so I thought that both McKinsey and I would argue that to some extent Goldman sort of fell into that trap. The good news is McKinsey has, I think, to a large extent righted the ship, had a lot of self-awareness as an institution and said, you know what, we got away from our values. And, you know, and I think they're back to where they were. So when I went to Asbury Automotive Group, you know, it was really challenging for me because I ran into another situation like that. It was private equity held. The private equity guy, as the dot-com thing got really hot in 98, 99, we started a business called Greenlight.com, which I had helped initiate. And we drew in as partners, and this was the win, Kleiner Perkins, the big venture capital firm, and Amazon. And so this was going to serve as Amazon Automotive. So that was the big idea. And at the beginning, the private equity guy sort of poo-pooed it and said, you know, because he was a value investor, so, you know, valuation methods are different. But then all of a sudden, he started to fall in love with it. And we were structured so that we had bought all these dealerships, and we owned 51, and the other guys owned 49. And so, and we were going to need their cooperation for this business model to work. Well, at the 11th hour, as we capitalized this with Amazon, the documents come through, and all of a sudden, it's going to be owned by the private equity firm, not by Asbury. And I said, what is this all about? And he said, well, you know, we created the opportunity. We're going to hold on to it. It's going to be a quick flip. We want to be able to spin it out and take advantage of the IPO market with it. And I said, yeah, but what about the dealers who I just got all very excited about this? And he said something along the lines of, screw them. And I said, you know, and again, I ran into some other personal issues. There were a bunch of things that, but, you know, I had another moment where I said, I don't know if this is going to be consistent with the way I want to operate. And so, you know, I went in the hat business. It all worked out.
Other questions? Anybody got anything else you want to ask? Yes.
What's your approach on dealing with ambiguity and unknown?
Sorry, say that again.
What's your approach on dealing with ambiguity and unknown?
So dealing with the
ambiguity.
Yeah.
Well, you know, this is where it's interesting. There's a couple of points here. The McKinsey trading kicks in hard because step one is to get rid of as much ambiguity as you can. But the biggest struggle that most people come out of McKinsey, what they struggle with the most, is that you can't get rid of all the ambiguity, right? Because there's a certain level of judgment that is applied in all of this. And so, you know, as we run into decisions that have an amount of ambiguity to them, you know, we start to apply judgment. I, for some reason, am different from a lot of my colleagues at McKinsey, because the track record is, there's a lot of people who don't make that conversion well. I had a partner at McKinsey come to me at around the 6 or 7 year mark and suggested I leave the firm because she said, you're better in this operating environment where the decisions have to be made than necessarily being the supporting analysis. And so she had figured out early on that maybe I just had a certain level of comfort with ambiguity, I don't know why, and an ability to sort of work through it and get to a decision, not look back, move forward, and say, okay, we've made the call. Now, lesson for you guys. At the time when she said, you should leave McKinsey because you'd be very good at this, all I heard was, you should leave McKinsey. Again, it's, it goes back to the self-awareness thing. I wasn't willing at the time to kind of probe and say, well, tell me more about why you think I might be better over here than over here. And yet she was right. And I just didn't hear it the first time.
So these great folks have a class in a few minutes, so I'm going to close this out with a couple of questions. And we had a tradition kind of doing this at the end of asking some sort of real quick questions and hopefully some quick answers. Who taught you the most?
Marvin Bower, the original founder of McKinsey.
Favorite leadership book or books?
Undaunted Courage for a long time, which is, if you don't know it, it's about Lewis and Clark's expedition, followed by Moneyball. I think Moneyball is a great business book.
Least favorite buzzword?
Strategize. I'm not sure it's a word. I know strategy is a word. Somewhere along the way, strategize became a word.
And the Bush variation on that is strategery, right?
Right.
So your boss's business complained about you, and somebody said, well, you know, how can a boss, you're a CEO and a chairman, how can you have a boss? Do you have a boss?
You're my boss. You're on the board, so I want to hear this one.
I'm asking you, do we complain about you at all?
Well, the truth of the matter is, business is good right now. I'm getting no complaints. When we have our first downturn, I'll let you know.
Right.
That's how it works.
Spouse's biggest complaint about you?
Despite everything I said, that I'm not around enough.
Okay. And one piece of advice you would leave these folks with?
As you know, I'm passionate about this. Do a lot of self-assessment and find out what you think you'd really love to do. And that will carry the day. And your success will be more tied to the fact that you're loving what you do than that you chose to go into the hottest or coolest industry.
Join me in thanking Bob for being here.